Matasovska, and my pronouns are she and her. Welcome to my symposium presentation, which is titled School Staff and Pupils and the Experience of the LGBT+SEND Intersection. This relates to my Ph.D. Research, which is currently still ongoing, and I'll talk about it in more depth in the slides. But before I do so, let's start with the quote, which I'm going to read out in a second. As a former special educational teacher, I am aware of the importance of bringing relevant information to students with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND, to help them flourish in life, in their school life, and to also ensure that they have access to meaningful and useful information, including LGBT+SEND identities. And this brings me to Judith Butler's quote, which is on your screen. What makes for a livable world is no idle question. It is not merely a question for philosophers. It is posed in various idioms all the time by people in various walks of life. If that makes them all philosophers, then that is a conclusion I'm happy to embrace. Pupils with SEND are a category of pupils who rely on us educators to make an important information accessible to them. As pupils with SEND, they often have additional needs and they need support with learning, receiving information, and so on. And this is even more important in the case of pupils with SEND who have protected characteristics such as being LGBT+. They need the support of the educators, of those involved with the education, in order to understand about themselves, their identities, and to feel fully included and also supported in their school environments. So a little bit about me next. Like I said, my pronouns are she and her. I am a former SEN teacher, and my research is of an intersectional character due to obviously exploring the LGBT+ and intersection as part of my PhD research, which is basically about LGBT+ inclusion with pupils with SEND. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Educational Studies at Goldsmiths, and I also work as an associate lecturer in education, inclusion, and SEND at the University of Derby. I have also an intersectional character because I'm Christian and I'm bisexual. Originally, I'm from a different country as well. So I thought I would mention this intersectional aspect to my own identity because my research is very much of an intersectional character itself. So that's just a little bit about myself. In terms of the key terms that I'll be using in this symposium presentation, so I have a list of quite a few of them. Let's start with the acronym LGBT+, which is used to basically describe people who identify as heterosexual or cisgender. SEND stands for individuals with special educational needs and disabilities. And in the context of my thesis that I'm currently writing, this also includes pupils who have, additional needs. They need support with learning in order to thrive academically, but also generally speaking in school and in terms of the independence and so on. Cisgender refers to someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned at their birth. So, for example, if somebody asked me about my gender identity, I would identify as a cisgender female. Cisnormativity is the assumption that all individuals are cisgender, but also it privileges people that are cisgender. Heteronormativity is the assumption that all people are heterosexual or straight, in other words, and intersectionality is actually one of the two theoretical frameworks that I'm using for my PhD research. And it basically is a tool that helps us understand different aspects of one's personality and how these different aspects, or let's say protected characteristics, can impact each other, and how that can basically lead to marginalization of individuals with one or more protected characteristics. Sometimes, if we're talking about an individual with more than one protected characteristics, as they are listed in the Equality Act 2010, for example, in the context of my research being LGBT+, and also having SEND, that can lead to what I call layered stigma. So we're talking about layers of marginalization because there's more than one protected characteristic involved. So, for example, a disabled student who also, let's say, is trans or is LGBT+, is more likely to be, a victim of bullying in school environments than a straight non-disabled pupil. Performativity. So performativity can be talked about in a number of different ways, but I have decided to include, Stephen Ball's definition of performativity. He is a scholar who has written about, how the neoliberal era impacts the apparatus of schools, which is very much still, ongoing even now. And basically, he argues that performativity is basically talking about a new mode of state regulation, one that requires individual school practitioners to organize themselves according to their targets. So in response to their targets, in response to the indicators and evaluations that are part of their everyday school life. And as you know, schools are very much performance driven, for example, in terms of, achieving the Ofsted based requirements and so on. Next, I have, next I should also mention what performative means, because I'll use that term here. And it's derived from performativity, but in the context of my research, when I say performative, I basically mean acted out. Something is acted out or being carried out or conducted only on the surface of things rather than in depth. So I am basically talking about LGBT+ inclusion related approaches that are performative, that focus on creating LGBT+ inclusive environments only through superficial or on the surface fixes that are often quick, very much visually based, because they're easily spotted that way. But the more in-depth approaches are missing when we talk about performative LGBT+ inclusion. And in-depth approaches include things like including pupils with SEND LGBT+ identities in things like policy overhauls or curriculum overhauls and things like that. Basically documents that impact the school life. And that's where the in-depthness often lies. But it also lies in other aspects. Then on the list I have disability performativity. Basically, that is the other theoretical framework I use as part of my PhD thesis that I'm currently writing. It has been developed from Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. Basically, it challenges, gender performativity challenges the conventional understanding of gender, as well as the relationship between gender and sex. In her Gender Trouble book, Butler argues that gender and sexuality are not fixed identities, and similarly, identities of disabled individuals are not permanent. Barnard, 2010. And even things like, disability terms, such as special educational needs related terms, they're also not fixed, as we know. They evolve over time. The language of SEND evolves and changes over time. So, in that respect, there are lots of similarities between gender performativity and disability performativity. But obviously, it goes deeper than just that, than just the language. Disability performativity within the context of my research basically serves as a tool to discuss a number of issues such as the invisibility of disabled pupils, LGBT plus identities in schools, and also the school culture, which is often riddled with heteronormative bias. And obviously this impacts the approach schools take towards LGBT plus and inclusion, as I have witnessed in the schools where I interviewed school staff and pupils. So in a gist, I use disability performativity to talk about also ableism too. And for those who are not familiar with the term ableism, it basically means discrimination or social prejudice against disabled people. And this also includes doubting the ability to have LGBT plus identities. And the last term on the list is queer. So that's a word that describes sexual and gender identities other than straight and cisgender. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people may all identify with the word queer, or they may also use the term queer when asked about how they identify. Instead of saying I'm LGBT plus, they might say I'm queer. Okay, so that's the key terms. Thank you for your patience. It was quite a list, but I think it's important to cover these before we go further into the next slides. So some of the ways of thinking, and some of the ways that have framed my ways of thinking while researching my PhD topic include the work of scholars exploring sexual and also gender identity as well as disability. So I included Alex Toth, Sentinel Martineau. They both write about sexuality, gender, disability. Toth is a sociologist basically, and he has written a number of fantastic works on the LGBT plus and intersection. He has had a big impact on me even prior to my PhD studies, because I read his works prior to my own start of my PhD studies, and I was hugely impressed with his work. He has also made me realize that the literature on the LGBT plus and intersection, not just in the UK but globally speaking, is very limited. As a former SEN teacher who worked with pupils with this intersection, that bothered me, because as a practitioner back then, I needed some answers to some of the questions I had about how to support this category of pupils effectively. And there wasn't enough information, basically. And so I felt so strongly and passionately about that I decided to go into my PhD journey with the aim of researching LGBT plus inclusion in schools with SEND provisions. So he was a big influence. The others include Judith Butler, who I already mentioned. Her theory of gender performativity is the basis of disability performativity, which I mentioned already, and disability performativity is one of my two theoretical frameworks. So Butler is obviously a big influence. And also, obviously, I have intersectionality there. In terms of intersectionality-related scholars, I've got Crenshaw as one example, just because she was the first scholar who coined the term intersectionality in the 1990s. She's a famous feminist scholar from the USA. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with her name. On your screen, you also see the book by Alex Toth that I read prior to my PhD studies, Young, Disabled and LGBT+, which was a fascinating read and still is. And a book by Dr. Alexandra Sewell called Diverse Voices in Educational Practice, as it features my experience of running LGBT+ or rainbow clubs, as we called them back then, with pupils with SEND who also registered as blind. So that was prior to my PhD studies. So that was the type of work I was doing back then, which also inspired me to conduct this PhD. And my experience is described in chapter 8, if you're interested in reading more about it. Okay, so I think, I should also add that the research out there has inadequately engaged with practitioners who work with students, with pupils with this intersection. And often it does not include the views directly from this category of pupils, or even the practitioners' views. And whatever research is out there often includes, college students, if anything, not so much primary or secondary pupils with this intersection. So I try to change that with my own research, and just looking at the situation now in terms of the global literature out there, I'm one of the few scholars who actually write about this intersection in terms of primary and secondary levels of schooling. So I'm glad that hopefully my research might bring something new and hopefully useful to practitioners. Moving on, so I obviously started to talk about the theoretical frameworks already, but just some other key aspects to my doctoral research project are the main sources of data, basically. So these include talking to school staff or teachers who work in schools with SEND provisions, also talking to SEND practitioners who have worked with pupils with the LGBT+SEND intersection as well. But I should also mention that outside of my PhD studies, I work as a researcher for Goldsmiths, and basically, in particular, I work as an external evaluator for this project called Equally Safe. It's an identity-based anti-bullying program that runs in 240 schools over a span of 3 years. It's a DFE-funded project, and basically I go into schools and talk to many pupils and teachers about the inclusive efforts in relation to this program. And Equally Safe program is basically aimed at schools who are trying to create more inclusive environments for their pupils. And part of this is obviously including pupils with the LGBT+SEND intersection. But generally speaking, it also covers other protected characteristics such as race and religion, and the characteristics that are listed in the Equality Act 2010. Okay, I should also mention that I'm allowed to use data from my research visits as part of my work on this project. So I'm allowed to use the data from my PhD. So I'm very fortunate like that. And I am also my research also involves a participatory element, basically, because I invite the pupils that I talk to from primary and secondary schools to produce questions for the focus groups as well. So I have my own semi-structured interview questions ready, but I also invite them to produce their own, and that enables me to see basically what they're interested in finding out themselves in relation to this intersection and in relation to LGBT+SEND inclusion. It helps me see what they want to find out, what they want to talk about, what's important to them, things like that you don't usually actually, as I said, really come across in studies around this intersection. So I try to cover that element with my own research as well. Okay, the key themes. So I should stress that, my analysis is not exactly finished yet. I have not finished my PhD research project just yet, but I am at a stage where, my data is collected. And so I'm just finishing off some of the analysis parts to it. But the key theme that really is popping out is the fact that the schools that I've visited, adopt the performative approach to LGBT+ inclusion. So these are schools with SEND provisions. Again, I just want to stress, and I'll go into that a little bit more on the next few slides. The other theme that is also very evident is the fact that what constitutes this performative approach is the fact that lots of school staff lack training and understanding regarding the LGBT+SEND overlap, especially around gender identity. there is a lot of fear, sometimes stigma when you don't have enough information, when you don't have clear guidelines. Often that can impact how school staff support LGBT+SEND pupils. I'm not saying that the intention isn't good, but if you don't have enough information, obviously that can certainly impact levels of support, and so that can create problems and also can contribute to performative approaches to LGBT+SEND inclusion. And the other thing that is also becoming quite apparent as a theme within that performative approach to LGBT+ inclusion umbrella is the silencing of the voices of LGBT+ pupils with SEND. So that can include pupils, for example, who are trans and autistic, and that can also include parents of pupils who have this intersection. You know, not all of the parents' views are positive towards LGBT+ concepts, and unfortunately, you know, a lot of what is spoken about at home can actually rub off on these pupils as well. And so these attitudes are sometimes brought into schools, and they talked about with other pupils and so on. So it can be a problematic area, and so I thought I would just bring that to your attention. Okay, next I'm going to talk about my theoretical frameworks. I already started to talk about intersectionality and disability performativity, but just to clarify, obviously, within the context of my research, I'm just focusing on mostly LGBT+ and SEND. These are the two key aspects when it comes to intersectionality, and in terms of disability performativity. So what I mean here is, again, I mentioned already Butler's theory of gender performativity, which disability performativity is closely linked to or is almost derived from. Butler is a feminist scholar who is well known in relation to queer theory. I'm only mentioning this in case we have some attendees who are not so familiar with Butler or are not from academic circles. I will not go into explaining about queer theory, but I thought it would be I thought it would be interesting or important to mention it. I've also wanted to explain why I've chosen disability performativity as my other theoretical framework. This is because many of its aspects are similar to gender performativity, and the issue of negative reactions that queer or LGBT+ people can get sometimes just because based on who they are and you know, and how they are around others. Some people might have an issue with that, and I'll explain a bit more. So if they don't act in so-called expected ways or according to the heteronormative or cisnormative norms, that can trigger other people. It can basically lead to negative reactions, stigma, marginalization, and so on. People who present their gender and sexuality outside of these cisnormative and heteronormative norms can experience negative reactions and even violence, according to Lee 2012 and Blondil et al. 2018. So, for example, this could include a trans person, so someone whose gender identity is not aligned with the sex assigned at their birth. And if they express their trans identity through clothes that, you know, that are in vertical commas not expected from them, you know, that can lead to adverse reactions. And disabled people also face negative reactions, often in relation, obviously, to their disability, and that has a lot to do with ableist attitudes, or with the way, in other words, how you know, able-bodied or non-disabled members of our society, some of them, expect disabled people to act in order to fit into their environment, rather than the other way around. In the famous Examine Life documentary, Butler talks to a disability activist called Sunaura Taylor, and she points out that disabled people are in a similar position to queer people, since they also experience adversity and violence just because they might present their disability, i.e. bodily movements, in ways that are different to ableist society's expectations about what disability should look like. So, for example, passing an object using a mouth instead of hands, which are disabled, might be the preferred way of passing objects for a person with this type of disability. But that can trigger adverse reactions to somebody who did not expect that. And Sunaura Taylor, she discusses disability with Butler and states that disabled people can also get attacked because the impairments can remind non-disabled people that one day their bodies will age and stop functioning in the way they're accustomed to. This is an important point because, as you know, some homophobic attacks have been carried out by people who, are considered or assumed to be, not out of the closet, so to speak. So when they see people who are openly LGBT+, that can trigger something in them because of their own denial of their own LGBT+ identities. So I thought I'd just mention that just as a comparison. And I should also add that Taylor and Butler converse about disability as not merely some physical status, but rather a social status, which also applies to individuals with no physical disabilities. And we also know that we have people with disabilities that are so-called non-visible or not visible at first glance. So it's important to remember that too. Obviously, there is more to disability performativity, but unfortunately, I won't have time to go into all of this in this symposium. So let me move on. Okay, so next, I'm going to talk about really the key component of this symposium presentation, and that's the views and experiences of school staff and pupils, which is the title of this presentation. However, I felt it was important to give you background to my research, so thank you for bearing with me. So yes, the first one on the list is basically being LGBT+. As part of my PhD journey, I have come across attitudes and misconceptions about the LGBT+ and overlap, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes from academic literature, and sometimes through the views of participants or through the responses talking about other colleagues that can have sometimes negative attitudes towards the LGBT+ and intersection, or misleading ones, shall we say. So being LGBT+, is it a trend? Is it a phase that they'll grow out of, if they have SEND? That is one that is quite profound. And basically, what it comes down to is assuming that because they have SEND, these pupils, they have disabilities or cognitive impairments, etc., they're not in a position, or they're not able to be mature enough, if you like, to have LGBT+ identity. So again, that links to ableism, which I mentioned already earlier. It's that ableist attitude that basically is a prejudice against disabled people and assuming things for them, including sexual orientation and gender identity. For example, in the case of trans autistic pupils, there is often that assumption that they're easily impressionable, and so they're gonna follow this so-called trans trend and gonna identify as trans because it's cool, it's modern, it's in fashion now, and they just want to fit in because they have autism and so on. So it's awful attitudes, really, or misconceptions like that, unfortunately, that can sometimes be present even amongst school staff working with pupils with this intersection. I'm not saying all of them, but it does happen. I should also point out that some scholars who have written about autism and LGBT+ identities have done so through the deficit lens, and what that means is they research this topic in order to kind of point out on, well, what is wrong with autistic people look at, the prevalence of, or the high number of autistic people identifying as LGBT plus, what's wrong with them, So I thought I'd mention that that there is research out there like that, unfortunately, too. But I think things are changing now, and there is more studies now who are actually ensuring that the views of those who are being researched about are actually somehow part of that whole research process. Like I said, I also have an element of a participatory element to do with my own pupil participants with this intersection, and so I think it's important to do research not just on them but also with them. That's what I'm trying to say. And the other important aspect that I want to talk about is obviously the performative approaches to LGBT plus inclusion in schools with SEND provisions, which I already talked about a little bit earlier. But really, there's obviously quite a few layers within that. Lack of training is obviously one of them. So also clearer guidelines, more training is needed about LGBT plus RSE related concepts, about the LGBT plus and intersection. Also lack of training can impact the confidence of school staff. That means when they're talking to parents, that can also create issues, or they might be afraid to teach about certain concepts for the fear of parental reactions, or even the reactions from the management sometimes as well. The hierarchy of needs basically refers to the fact that, like I said, in the neoliberal era, one of the key aims for schools is really to achieve highly. And so to focus on core subjects and pupils achieving excellent data in these two areas like math and English, I mean, is quite up there on top of the list, when it comes to the hierarchy of needs or priorities for schools. So LGBT plus inclusion doesn't quite fit with that. Because it's not exactly academically motivated in terms of attainment, so that's something that I thought I mentioned, LGBT plus inclusion as a result is usually at the bottom of this list of needs and priorities of schools. And that can lead to what I said earlier, those quick fixes of LGBT plus inclusion that give the impression of an in-depth LGBT plus inclusion at first glance because of the visual elements involved, or, like displays or putting on assemblies with LGBT plus themes once or twice a year. Again, that's not an in-depth approach. Really, what's needed is having curricula that is, a representative of LGBT plus and pupils as well. So that's just one example of what a more in-depth LGBT plus inclusion could look like. And then I have the silencing part. So basically, silencing is referring to, like I said, some of the views of the parents, impacting the views of the children or of the pupils. Also, sometimes the issue of having of being trans and also autistic can lead to what I call double masking for some of these students. In order to fit in, they have that pressure to mask the autistic traits or traits of another neurotype in order to feel like they're going to fit in. And on top of that, if they have LGBT plus identities, there's that double masking involved. So that can create huge problems in terms of emotional well-being and feeling supported, the pastoral support and aspects like that. So yeah, but also what I'm trying to say is, the voices of the pupils with SEND LGBT plus identities, they're not often validated, or they're not believed. They're not often sought out when it comes to, for example, curriculum overhauls and, like I said, the policy overhauls or policy creative processes. They often not involved, these pupils, unfortunately, and yet these things do impact their school lives. So I'm talking about the school apparatus being designed in certain ways and it relates to something that Michel Foucault talks about. He claims that power is always connected to strategy to control others. And I will explore some of these ideas in more depth in the next few slides, especially through some of the extracts from the data that I have prepared for you. Okay, so trend or phase, being LGBT plus. These students were sent easily influenced. Are they too immature to form LGBT identities or LGBT plus identities? These are some of the questions that some of the staff have been asking me when they were recalling some of the attitudes of their colleagues and so on. Like I said, research about this intersection is still very much limited, and some doubt that this LGBT+SEND overlap is real. So I put a list of some of the statistics about this LGBT+SEND intersection onto this slide in front of you, just to kind of have a look for yourself. And while you're reading that, I should also add that, access for some researchers to so-called vulnerable, participants with this intersection, it can be a real problem. When I first started my data collection, I had quite a limited access to LGBT+SEND pupils. Things have luckily changed with time, and I've had since then, since the first initial stages, I've had more opportunities to interview pupils with this intersection, but maybe that's one of the reasons why also there is, a lack of literature about this intersection in particular, and also in particular in relation to having those views directly, from those pupils with this intersection. Yes, I already talked about some of the research that is out there that talks about, this intersection through the deficit lens. But that I already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into that. So I think I'm just going to move quickly because I want to just read out some of the data, the views expressed by the participants. So this one relates to lack of training. And it goes as follows. Like for years 4, 5, and 6, we have been learning about it, gender identity, but the teachers tell us not to tell the younger children about it so that we don't worry them about stuff that is in the future. So this quote relates to the fear the scaremongering that can exist in some schools in relation to gender identity. Often that reflects the fears that the staff have themselves about gender identity related concepts, based on the fact that they don't have enough training about it or enough understanding. And so they're scared to say the wrong thing, or they worry that they might scare others. And so they pass that fear on to their pupils as well. The next extract is from participants who talk about the hierarchy of needs that I mentioned earlier. Reputation is everything. Yes, we are a Catholic school, and there was a point when we ended up in a bit of a gray area when we were asking ourselves, do we explain to our children what a lesbian is, what a gay couple is? Because of the faith, there were some reservations at first, but Equality Teach worked really closely with our trust and explained to them and us that, yes, we can say these things without crossing the boundaries. So sometimes schools need that reassurance, like a backup of a national educational charity like Equality Teach, who have that Equally Safe program that I talked about earlier, in order to feel reassured that, yes, we can do that and we have a support in case there are adverse parental reactions at play. So again, that points out at some of the issues that are there in terms of approaches towards LGBT plus concepts, both from school and parents. And one last one relating to silencing, and then I'll go into the Q&A section. Some parents are incredibly hostile to LGBT issues, even when it comes to LGBT books being ordered for our library. They're saying it's absolutely disgusting what you're doing. You're promoting LGBT plus. And I said, no, it's not promoting. This is coming from the children. That's what they're interested in. What are you worried about? if you had a child identifying in this way, how would you feel if they weren't represented in this school? So that is something that I wanted to share with you. I already talked about some of the misconceptions and attitudes. I should also add that some of the attitudes of especially older school staff are still affected by Section 28, which legally lost its effect back in 2003. But as you know, for decades it was still part of the school culture and influenced some of the views of now older generation. And they're still scared to sometimes speak about certain LGBT+ concepts as a consequence of the time when everything was being monitored in relation to LGBT+ concepts. So here are my references, and next I am ready for the Q&A. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for listening.